The Marvel Cinematic Universe, known to almost all of mankind by the three most destructive letters in all of entertainment, MCU. It unites the millions and millions of movie lovers across the world. It's also made the hardest of men become 4-year-olds again and has sparked reactions like this within cinemas.
Reed Richards.
Now, I'm not about to bore you with a history lesson of who started what and who owns what. That's why there's Wikipedia. But I know a lot of casual moviegoers who have interest in the MCU but don't really know where to start and don't exactly know which events tie into what. Even very heavy MCU fanatics don't understand some things even after sitting through post-credits. Those people are a lot better than those that get up. Which is why, and I can't believe I'm about to do this. In this video, I'm going to explain the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe as it presently stands. That means I have to explain everything from the first Iron Man movie in 2008 to episode 3 of the Disney Plus series Ms. Marvel. I advise you grab a snack or somewhat anything. This is about to be one wild ride. So the MCU is made of 35 different installments. Now 28 of these are feature-length movies, with the remaining 7 being Disney Plus series projects. Now the number would have been a lot bigger than 35 if the president of Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, head honcho, would have added the Marvel ABC series such as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as well as the Netflix and Hulu installments like Luke Cage and Daredevil, Punisher, The Inhumans, all them folks. But since he never directly oversaw those projects as he has with the main MCU, some elements tend to look really out of place and can be very confusing when matched up to the MCU's continuity. So they've practically become standalone projects? Well, sort of. Now, there are 2 ways to understand the MCU. The first is in the order of release context, which is how the movies have been released since 2008. Now, here's the thing. This format, for the most part, is actually correct in chronological order, especially when you look at phases 2 and 3. But not all the time. Then there is the second way of understanding, which is the actual chronological order, and this one can get really weird because even people within Marvel Studios and Disney can't seem to agree on which movies fit in at what points in some cases. This format also breaks the regular viewing experience of watching according to phases. So say you might watch a phase 3 movie before a phase 1 movie. Sometimes it's happened before. Alright, so I have made mention of the term phases quite a number of times. Now let me explain that. So a phase in the MCU is a set of movies that usually ends with a major movie event, usually featuring every character that has played a role in getting to that point, say in a solo movie of theirs. Now the MCU is currently made of 4 phases and each of them is seemingly bigger than the last in terms of the volume of movies that are released in that. So now we've explained all of those basic terminologies and elements, so we might as well start talking about the movies. But before we do, if you're loving this video so far, please give it a like. More people will find this video that way. Also, do subscribe. Thank you. Alright, let's dive in. So our story through the MCU starts in 2008 with the release of Iron Man 1. Now this serves as the origin story for Tony Stark, who is a playboy philanthropist, a billionaire, a man who has inherited his father's business called Stark Industries that is responsible for manufacturing weapons. So at the start of the movie, Tony is in this convoy in Afghanistan, and that convoy gets attacked by a terrorist group that is known as the 10 Rings. Now one of the missiles that eventually would explode into Tony's chest is in fact made by Stark Industries. And this exploding missile leaves some shards of metal in his chest and he's knocked unconscious. And when he wakes up, he realizes he is in fact captive in a cave with a doctor who was actually responsible for saving his life called Ho Jensen. Now this doctor implanted an electromagnet into Tony's chest which would prevent the remaining shards of metal that he couldn't pull out from potentially reaching Tony's heart and killing him in the process. There we get a flashback to understand why Tony is in Afghanistan, and he was trying to sell the US military on a new weapon called the Jericho missile, which would wipe out their opposition in droves. Now, whilst Tony and Dr. Jensen are in this cave, they are approached by the leader of the Ten Rings. His name is Raj, and he offers them the chance to build a Jericho missile for his organization from scratch at the cost of their own freedom. Now, since these men did not believe what Raj was saying, they decided to build a prototype armored suit, which would be known as the Mark I Iron Man suit. Now, they were given a deadline, so the whole time the people that were supplying Tony and Jensen with the materials to make the missile did not realize they were actually making something very different. So by the time everything was ready to go, these men got attacked. Unfortunately, Dr. Jensen got killed, but Tony was able to destroy all of the weaponry and fight off the opposition and leave the cave. Then Tony is rescued, brought back to the US, where he reunites with his personal assistant Pepper Potts, as well as Obadiah Stane, who is his business manager and his father's former friend. Now, because of what Tony had seen in Afghanistan and how these wars fought by his own weaponry had split the people and made them impoverished, Tony decided he wanted to get Stark Industries away from the weaponry business, but Obadiah Stane did not agree with this decision. So Tony, being the tinkerer that he is, finds a way to replace the electromagnet in his chest with a miniature arc reactor, as well as developing the prototype suits that he had escaped Afghanistan with. Meanwhile, we find out that Obadiah Stane was in contact with the Ten Rings in Afghanistan and knew about Tony's capture and didn't do anything about it. And as all this is happening, Pepper does find some evidence that points to Stane's connection with the Ten Rings and realizes she is in danger, and she seeks some protection from Phil Coulson, who had actually shown up earlier in the movie. Now, Phil Coulson at this point in time is an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and S.H.I.E.L.D. is, well, the full meaning is on the screen right now, but S.H.I.E.L.D. is practically like the CIA of the MCU, but sort of like the CIA but not the CIA, if that makes any sense. Then in a meeting at Tony's house, Obadiah Stane finds a way to maim Tony, take the arc reactor from his chest and use it to power something that he has been working on himself called the Ironmonger suit, which is practically an Iron Man suit times maybe 50,000. But thanks to Pepper Potts, Tony's life was saved and he's able to take on the Ironmonger suit and Obadiah Stane, and eventually defeats them after Obadiah Stane falls into the giant arc reactor that was in one of the warehouses of Stark Industries. After that, Tony has a press conference where he reveals to the world that he is in fact Iron Man, and this sets the precedent for the entire MCU, because in this MCU reality, no one has a secret identity. Everyone is known as who they are. The post-credit scene for this movie shows Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson, who comes to contact with Tony after sneaking into his house, convincing him to join the Avenger Initiative. And then we move to the next movie, The Incredible Hulk, in 2008. Can I be honest? We really don't need to talk about this movie. It is not consequential to the MCU in any way, shape or form. Probably the worst movie the MCU has ever produced. I'm sorry, I had to say it. And oh, this was not Mark Ruffalo Hulk. This was Edward Norton Hulk, the one and only time he actually appears as that. None of the characters aside Emil Blonsky, who's played by Tim Roth, and Thunderbolt Ross ever appears in another MCU movie. I'll touch a little on this movie story when we get to the Captain America movie in a few minutes, but now let's move on to Iron Man 2, which was the next movie. Now, 6 months after the events of Iron Man 1, the US Congress wants to confiscate Tony Stark's Iron Man suit, seeing that it could be beneficial to the US military and also because a private citizen should not be able to be in possession of such a piece of technology. But Tony Stark being Tony Stark, they can't get it, and the US government brings in Justin Hammer to rival what Tony has created and gives him a contract to develop armory for the US government. Now, Justin Hammer is a bit of a shady man. He does his digging and he goes ahead to release a Russian prisoner, Ivan Vanko. Ivan Vanko was actually an associate of Tony Stark's dad, Howard Stark. They developed the initial arc reactor technology, and then they had a bit of a falling out, and somehow Howard got all the proceeds whilst Vanko was left with nothing, and then he ended up in jail. And since Vanko was a man with revenge on his mind, Justin Hammer saw this as an opportunity to not only harness that anger into defeating and putting Iron Man down once and for all, but also being able to be successful with no opposition from Stark Industries. A subplot in this story as well is Tony's arc reactor is slowly killing him because an element that was used to produce the arc reactor is somewhat corroding, and it's making him really sick as the days go by. Tony is also trying to find this hidden element which is supposed to help this problem go away. This movie also sees the introduction of Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, and what happens with this is Natasha is hired by Pepper Potts to be her personal assistant after Pepper was made CEO by Tony, and Tony kind of stepped away from Stark Industries. This movie also sees the second MCU recasting, as Terrence Howard was replaced by Don Cheadle as James Rhodes, who is supposed to be Tony's best friend. So as always, in the end there's a huge confrontation. Vanko is killed, I think, and Hammer is imprisoned for his treacherous nature. In the course of the movie, once again we see Agent Phil Coulson, who is offering assistance to Pepper and to Nick Fury. Then he mentions that there's a bit of a weird disturbance going on in New Mexico that he has to go and check out, as it is official SHIELD business. And in the post-credit scene we see that in fact Thor's hammer has landed in a crater on Earth. The next movie on our list is Thor. So this is where the MCU starts to rely on Norse mythology, as the comic books have done. We get Odin, the All-Father, Thor's father, Frigga, Thor's mother, Loki, who is supposed to be Thor's brother but actually isn't. We'll talk about that in a second. In this movie, Thor is supposed to be crowned king of Asgard by his father Odin, as Odin is about to go into Odin's sleep. It's technically the state where Odin is asleep but he's also dead but not dead. It's kind of like to recover. I know it sounds funny. And before Thor is crowned, there's a disturbance in the vault. Frost giants try to attack Asgard and steal the casket of ancient winters, which is supposed to be this relic that will help you win wars by freezing your opponents. But the frost giants are stopped by the destroyer, which is this robot looking thing which it destroys things, I guess. Now Thor, being immature and being a hothead at this point in time, wants to go and exact a form of revenge or send a message, and wants to go to Jotunheim, which is where the frost giants live. Odin counsels him not to do it, but somehow he sneaks off with his friends called the Warriors 3. And the gatekeeper Heimdall also says that nothing has escaped his watch, and he does not understand how the frost giants were able to get into Asgard without him even knowing. So they use the power of the Bifrost. The Bifrost is the mode of transportation between realms that the Asgardians use. So they get to Jotunheim, Thor starts to destroy things and make a mess of things, and then Odin eventually comes trying to make peace with the king of the frost giants, but that doesn't really go over well. So when he pulls them out, he gets into a fight with Thor. Not a fist fight, just a shouting match. And because of this fight, Odin banishes Thor to Earth. He strips him of his power, but he also sends Mjolnir, which is the hammer that Thor wields, after him. But he can't use it, he can't lift it yet until he learns how to be worthy, or not. Actually, he doesn't learn how to be worthy, he just becomes worthy. Now upon his arrival, Thor is actually hit by a van which is occupied by 3 researchers: Darcy Lewis, Eric Selvig, and Jane Foster. So they try to talk to Thor and understand exactly who he is, not exactly considering that he's actually from Asgard. And then Thor actually finds Mjolnir in the same spot where the hammer landed at the end of Iron Man 2. The only thing is now SHIELD has built a whole military base thing around it, so you can't get in without certain clearances. So Thor finds a way to get to the facility, knocks out a few guards in the process, finally gets to the hammer, but he cannot raise it, and he is then apprehended and he's brought up to speed on, you know, who he might be, and weird interrogation scene basically. But afterwards, he's bailed out by Eric Selvig and Jane Foster, and they start to teach him the ways of Earth, and it's his bond with Jane that practically helps him to regain his worth. In the meantime, on Asgard, Loki and Odin have this confrontation, and Loki makes it known that he knows he is not Odin's biological son, and he is in fact a frost giant who was taken from Jotunheim after he was abandoned and left to die. So that shock triggered the Odin sleep for Odin and paved the way for Loki to ascend to the throne of Asgard in the absence of Odin and Thor. And to solidify this, it was then revealed that Loki had in fact made a deal with the frost giants to come to Asgard when Odin slipped into the Odin sleep so that they would kill him, and then he sent the destroyer robot thing to Earth to just decimate Thor. But that does not happen. Odin is not killed. Thor regains his worthiness and fights off the destroyer, then returns to Asgard to take on Loki, and in the end Loki falls to his seeming death. Odin then wakes up and things are seemingly back to normal. Thor has learnt his lesson, even though now he is separated from the woman he loves, which is Jane Foster. In the post-credit scene, we see that Loki is in fact not dead, and this post-credit scene ties in with the Avengers movie later. Up next, we have Captain America, the First Avenger. This story follows Steve Rogers, who is a scrawny young man who just wants to serve his country and do good. His best friend, James Bucky Barnes, is in the army already, so he kind of wants to join him. Steve tries to apply for the army, but he is rejected. However, a doctor who has been watching on the side, Dr. Erskine, decides to let him try out a serum that he has been developing that would potentially develop super soldiers. This project was being conducted by the SSR, which is the early version of SHIELD. And when they run the trial on Steve, the serum works and it transforms him from this scrawny young man into a very well built human being. Unfortunately, there was this hitman who was amongst the observers who shot and killed Dr. Erskine shortly after the success of the serum was proven. This hitman worked for an organization called Hydra, which was the antithesis of SHIELD, or the SSR as it was then known. This Hydra organization is headed by Johann Schmidt, who is a German soldier who in fact was the first person to test Dr. Erskine's super soldier serum. It did have side effects and turned his skull red and peeled his facial skin off, hence him getting the name Red Skull. I did say I was going to touch on Hulk's story. Now, Hulk became Hulk because of Dr. Erskine's super serum that was slightly botched. And it was the same botched super serum that allowed for the creation of Emil Blonsky's Abomination, who is practically Hulk's ugly twin brother with fish gills. He also has this relic in his possession called the Tesseract, and he's harnessed its power in order to make weaponry that would wipe out his opposition with ease. So Steve Rogers then becomes known as Captain America. They have these propaganda concerts, and then he actually goes on the field to rescue a lot of soldiers that have been captured, including his own best friend Bucky Barnes. He starts to head these missions that help in taking down Hydra strongholds one at a time, and then unfortunately on one of these missions he loses his best friend Bucky after Bucky falls out of a train that they were taking possession of. The combination of the movie, Johann Schmidt, now Red Skull fully, takes on Captain America. Johann Schmidt is defeated by his own greed after he tries to grab the Tesseract with his bare hand, but then it transports him to the sky, and well, we think he's dead. We'll talk about this very soon. This fight between Cap and Red Skull happens on this plane that eventually was going to bomb New York City, so Captain America made the ultimate sacrifice and decided to sink it into a whole glacier. But before he goes down, he and Peggy Carter confess their love for one another and say they will reunite before he crashes. He then wakes up almost 70 years later in 2012, where it's a complete culture shock to him. His body was frozen for about 70 years at that point in time. He's addressed by Nick Fury and the situation is then de-escalated, but unfortunately he realizes he is too late for the dance he promised his one true love. Then we move to our first Avengers movie. In this movie we see the return of Loki, who came through a portal that was generated by Dr. Eric Selvig in an experiment that involved the Tesseract. Loki has this scepter in his hand which he uses to attack SHIELD agents and takes over Clint Barton, Hawkeye. So the whole movie becomes about taking down Loki in his quest to dominate and conquer Earth. It's also in this movie that we see Mark Ruffalo assume the role of Hulk for the first time after Edward Norton was recast after their 2008 movie. And in the culminating moments of this movie, we see Loki bring this army of extraterrestrial fish snake looking things called Chitauri that he absolutely tries to destroy New York with. New York people suffer in the MCU. But somehow in an heroic effort, we see Iron Man, Captain America, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hulk and Thor take down he and his army. Eventually Loki is taken back to Asgard to stand trial for his crimes on Earth. And in the post-credit scene we see that Thanos was the one who was behind this whole attack. So the Avengers rounds up the phase 1 movies, and then we move to phase 2 starting with Iron Man 3 in 2013.
Sleeping on me at my feet is where you'll lay. And take your head down on your knees like you pray. It's cool, I continue to kick, push like Lupe. But if you ain't grinding with me now, the grind is where you'll stay.